Welcome to the Safe Business Agility Podcast. This is the place to get advice, stories, perspectives, and updates about safe and related topics to help you work differently and build the future. This week's episode is brought to you by Rally, the only purpose-built solution designed to scale Agile and unite the enterprise to empower value stream management and digital transformation. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. This week's guest is Harry Max, the author of Managing Priorities: How to Create Better Plans and Make Smarter Decisions. This was a really fun conversation. I really enjoyed hearing about Harry's time at DreamWorks Animation, Apple, and just his general journey as a whole. He's a pretty cool guy. I really hope you enjoy this one with Harry Max. Harry, welcome to the podcast. You came to me from a mutual friend. How did you meet Luke?
Luke Holman. Let's see. A long time ago in a land far, far away, I worked at DreamWorks Animation, and I ran the intranet there, which is communications, collaboration, and publishing internal to the 3D animation studio. And animation is a big software project, right? So you've got to have really good systems that facilitate all of that. And I worked with a fabulous guy named Jim Meyer, who is now a VP at Slack. And I guess Jim was a neighbor of Luke's, and they got to talking one day. I'm guessing the concept of tequila came up. Next thing you know, Luke and I are having coffee at, it was either Red Rock in Mountain View or the Dana Street Coffee Roasting Company, and we became fast friends. He's worked, I've hired him a number of times. I've helped him on projects a number of times, but that's pretty much where we met.
I feel like everyone has a Luke story that's not too dissimilar to that. Like, you don't come across Luke on your own. You always get referred to Luke, and then once you got him, you got him.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a good guy. Well, cool. So you kind of gave us a little preview, Harry, into who you are with the DreamWorks piece. Would you mind just kind of giving us, a little bit about you, where you came from, how you got started, what are some of the cool things that you've done, and what are you doing now?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Perhaps in reverse chronological order, I'll tell you, today I'm an executive player coach, which is to say a fractional executive who does executive coaching as part of that. And I'm an individual executive coach working one-on-one with folks when I'm not doing this fractional role. But all of that started way back in the day. I was a technical writer, and I ended up at a company called Silicon Graphics. That was the company that produced the technology that was used for rendering the movie Jurassic Park. And we were shipping 6 linear feet of technical documentation with every system that we sold. And it occurred to me one day that a lot of what we were documenting was just bad design and challenges with using the system. And I proposed that we take a look at what documentation we would prefer to write and then maybe adjust the software to match the documentation rather than the other way around. That worked out pretty well, at least for the installation system. It simplified it from hundreds of pages to a fairly short document. They rewrote the installation model, and that was my foray into user experience design, effectively. And I went from Silicon Graphics to I got recruited to a company called HAL Computer System, which was in Campbell, and it was kind of was your early Silicon Valley $100 million funded startup kind of thing. And they were designing a 64-bit commercial Unix system, kind of before 64-bit systems were a thing and before commercial Unix systems were a thing. And when Fujitsu came in and offered to buy that company, I jumped as a consultant over to Apple and started working in their networking group. And my former boss from Silicon Graphics then recruited me away to help start a company called Virtual Vineyards. It became Wine.com. So we launched Virtual Vineyards in January of 1995, and it was kind of the first usable secure shopping cart for electronic commerce. And that was kind of the beginning of the career that I have now, so to speak. Went on to do, a number of different things since then. DreamWorks, went on to be executive at Rackspace. I was an executive coach at Google, and so on and so forth. Been in multiple startups, I've been in multiple large companies. I've been a strategy consultant in between, and just incredibly, grateful to be able to do what I do now.
That's a great and inspiring kind of background, Harry. And I got to pick on a few things. Out of curiosity, when were you at Rackspace? How long ago?
Yeah, I joined Rackspace in December of 2010 and left, I think, just the end of 2014.
Interesting. So our origin stories nearly crossed paths. Dave Meredith, who is the eventual CEO at Rackspace, actually hired me initially for my first post-military gig at VeriSign in Savannah, Georgia. He was given charge of a business unit that had been acquired. It was a wireless billing and operations support platform that was basically bought out of somebody's garage, written in COBOL. And the founders were told, hey, we'll give you like an extra 100 mil if you can get this thing web-based in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And they were like, of course we can do that.
Yeah.
So they pegged Dave to kind of oversee that. And he gave me an early shot, and he's been connected ever since. It's been kind of cool to see his career. But I do know he was at Rackspace, I believe about the same time I was in San Antonio, around 2018. So a little after you. And also, you mentioned a little bit about kind of your passion for UX and design. I was kind of curious, do you have any thoughts about the emerging domain of experience architecture?
Boy, that's a deceptively simple question with a remarkably complex answer, potentially.
Well, Harry, we have to get to 45 minutes here, so come on.
Can you focus it a little bit further?
So it's a passion of mine, right? So throughout my experiences in my career, I've been exposed to some really horrific experiences, both in terms as a patient in a hospital, just navigating different products and services in different organizations. And I was kind of introduced to the opposite of that in an organization I consulted with maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And they introduced me to the concept of experience architecture. And they said, we understand that our portfolio of services is diverse. And the customers that we serve, sometimes they're B2B, sometimes it's B2C. But every single experience that you have, though it may be different, you're going to know and recognize that it's from us.
Yeah.
And that's where the whole concept was introduced to me was, they kind of had this playbook that said, from a macro level, these are all of the things that all of our customers, no matter where they sit, internal, external, or otherwise, will feel, will experience. This is how the interaction with the systems will go. These are the expectations that we have. And then every business unit, we kind of distill that to their context and provide some narrowing guardrails. So, essentially, it's the typical architectural hierarchy applied specifically for experience. And I thought it was really cool. And it's one of the things that I'm kind of pushing hard to talk more about in SAFE. Personally, I believe that the products and services that you sell are important, but if you don't have a good experience in delivering those products or services, it doesn't matter how good they are, no one's going to use them. And a recent experience I had with that was I was working on a campaign, and this system that I was introduced to was insanely powerful. But to get to the system to use it, I had to log into a remote desktop and essentially into Windows Server 2000. I don't know, it looked like Windows 2000. And the user experience was just so horrible. I didn't care how powerful the solution was. And I think a lot more organizations need to understand that, right? It's what you do is great. However, in 2024, there's no shortage of options. So if you want to win, you've got to deliver an outstanding experience.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, as somebody who's studied being an SPC, right, and as somebody who's familiar with scaled Agile and what it means to work at scale, and also somebody who knows what it means to come up with a concept and, sit in a garage with a spoon and a computer and try to figure out how to build something from scratch, and then everything in between, right? The idea of architects doing what they do, which is figuring out how to create something that really connects humans to an environment, and architecting the process of going about doing that and coming up with an architecture is something that, in an ideal world works from the micro all the way to the macro. And what designers tend to do pretty well, and I think architects also know how to do, is zoom up and zoom down. The question is, how do you take that perspective and layer it into artifacts, layer it into processes, layer it into assets, and put it together in a way that people can use it so that when you're connecting a diverse set of technologies, processes, data, so on and so forth, that the whole thing feels coherent because it's really about coherency, right? And it doesn't take much more than going into, a beautifully designed building, using kind of the pure sense of architecture, or going into a brilliantly designed planned community where, whether it's a planned community for residential or whether it's, something for, technology, everything needs to work together so that the wayfinding systems, people can move from where they are to where they want to be and don't get lost in the process. And they're not confused by the different messaging and the different terminology, the ontology of the whole experience, the look and feel, so on and so forth. To some extent, I think figuring out how to talk about this stuff in a simple and understandable way is the next frontier of what it means to take, experience architecture and turn it into something that people can do something with.
As I listen to you explain that, it occurs to me that, especially when you draw the parallels to architecture in terms of buildings and bridges and things like that, the way that we architect our solutions is very American. Mm-hmm. Right? If you go to France, you go to many European countries. I was in Prague last year, and I walked through a cathedral that was built in the 1200s and it burnt down. They rebuilt it in the 1500s, but you know what? It's gorgeous and it's timeless and it works. And all of the things it was designed to do, it does well. And if you compare that to the way that we do things in America in terms of building, as soon as something's 20 years old, we knock it down and start over, right? Because we design and build things as cheap as we can, given the context that we have today. And when it's no longer relevant, since we didn't build it to scale and to stand the test of time, we have to start over. And I find that many software architectures mirror that same kind of approach, right? We're so worried about doing things fast or integrating our new purchases fast that we fail to integrate them or design them or build them well, which gives us kind of that Winchester house. I'm sure you've seen it, that style of architecture in all of our organizations, right? And sometimes, not to, really quote a kind of a tired phrase, but you need to slow down to speed up. We're so focused on building what we need to build today that it then slows us down for everything we want to build tomorrow and the next day.
Yeah, and interesting. So many thoughts came to mind. Number one, this is the field of master planning looks at this, right? And that's a place to look at this. Another is, like, one of the most beautiful books I ever read was Alexander's, A Timeless Way of Building, which addresses the concepts that you're talking about very directly. And I talk about this. I have a whole chapter dedicated. Well, it's actually multiple chapters dedicated to slowing down in order to do the right thing, designing the right thing, thinking the right thoughts in order to get to the right place. And that's echoed in a book, incidentally, that Luke recommended to me a couple of weeks ago, which is fantastic, called Wiring the Winning Organization. If you haven't taken a look at it, I would definitely pick up a copy of it. It was the first 3 or 4 chapters sort of explain, why it is so important, not just why, but how it is to slow down, and then what it means to simplify things, to get down to their essence by, componentizing and serializing and taking things apart so that you can put them back together properly, and then looking at when you notice things and figuring out how to make sure that the signals are appropriately amplified so that so that you can take appropriate stock of the work that needs to be done or the things that you need to focus on. So the book is really about this notion of slowification, simplification, and amplification, and then provides a lot of case studies on that subject. So I think what you're talking about and what you're onto is really central to where we need to go as a species, frankly.
To take it a level deeper, this conversation kind of ties back to my wife and I read philosophy, and we try and just take small chunks and make sense of our chaotic lives. And there was a piece that we read yesterday, and it talked about how we spend so much time trying to control so many things and so many impressions and so many perceptions and so many even things in our body.
Mhm.
And the only thing that we can truly control is our mind.
Mhm.
Right? You've got some control over your body, but the reality is there's things that go on in there.
Mhm.
You can do your best to control, but you can't. So if the only thing we can truly control is our brain and our thought processes and
Mhm.
the things that we put into our brains, then the need to slow down and take things in and process them carefully becomes more apparent, because the more that we try and solve and satisfy and control the other things that are controlled by the minds of others, the more we struggle and the more we fail. And that really ties back to the domain of architecture, because if you think about what we've done to architects historically, we throw them a project and say, hey, architectural review board, promise me that this isn't going to break anything. And oh, by the way, here's 20 other things, and you've got a Tuesday afternoon to do it.
Yeah.
Well, then nothing can be solved correctly and nothing can be built elegantly, because we're just throwing so many things into the system that we never have the opportunity to stand back and look at the thing holistically.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. We've got to slow down and just focus on the things that we can control, and then do our best to start from there.
And to some
We're a
extent,
messy species, Harry.
yeah. Well, to some extent, that's really what the book is about. And, Jim Collins, is reported to famously have said, if you have more than three priorities, you have none.
Mm.
And I think the challenge is that we are elevating things that are important to too important. And therefore, those things that get elevated end up competing with the things that are really important. And we're not being clear enough about what's most important. And therefore, we're putting too much pressure on the people in the system to have to make trade-offs.
So, Harry, can you help us with that? Can you talk to us a little bit about decision making and making better decisions?
I hope so. The thesis of the book
Did
is
you like that segue, by the way? I thought that was pretty
beautiful.
slick.
Thank you. The thesis of the book is that
What is the book? If you would, Harry, just give us the introduction. We'll have it all in the show notes. But if you would, by the way, everyone, Harry wrote a book, and it's pretty interesting. And surprise, surprise, it's related to decision making. So, Harry, will you tell us about it?
Yeah. The book is called Managing Priorities, Creating Better Plans and Making Smarter Decisions. And the idea behind the book came to me because I was giving talks on diagnostic thinking and problem framing. And I gave a talk at USAA, I gave a talk at South by Southwest, ended up doing a TEDx talk on it. I was talking at Adobe, and nobody cared. However, in that talk, I touched on the topic of prioritization, and all the hands went up. Everybody was curious about prioritization. Look, I'm a student of user experience design, product design, development, whatnot. I'm like, that's a demand signal. People want more. I thought, well, how could it be that there aren't excellent resources on this topic? Turns out there's very little that's written about how to deal with prioritization as a holistic topic. So the book is really a look at, organization, the best organizations figure out how to prioritize. They're composed of teams that are relatively effective at prioritization, and those teams are composed of individual contributors and frontline managers that know how to prioritize. The challenge is that for individual contributors, they conflate prioritization with getting things done and personal productivity. Organizations tend to conflate prioritization with strategic and annual planning. So the more effective folks at prioritization tend to be at the team level. And the best way to think about it is that your priorities are, in effect, the inputs to your plans and your decisions. And so what the book does is the first part of the book takes a look at the meta process for prioritizing, which is not something I invented. It's something that I observed and then gave a name to, and it's called DGAP. And it's called that because it's about closing a gap between an as is or current state and a desired or future state. You're de-gapping, if you will. And the acronym stands for decide if you have time and if it's appropriate, engage, figure out who your stakeholders are, commit to the process, gather the items which are potential priorities and the metadata about them and any other information that's required. Arrange that information, figure out what sorting techniques, what frameworks, what marketplace simulations, what hybrid methods you might want to use. Participatory budgeting is a great example. And then actually engage in the act of prioritizing, right? I liken DGAP to thinking about, having worked at DreamWorks Animation, people talk about animation, but animation, when most people think about animation, they think about the act of animating a character, but animating a 3D 88-minute feature-length movie has many phases, only one of which is animating, but it's still called animate. The whole process is still called animation. So we have prioritization. The whole thing is prioritization. But when you really break it down and you look closely at it, it has a set of distinctive steps. And there are ways of thinking about each of those steps and a process for going through those steps. So the rest of the book looks at, okay, as an individual, what does it mean to prioritize? Both from an episodic point of view, that is to say, kind of a one-off or very infrequent kind of basis, like getting a job, perhaps, to habitual prioritization or periodic prioritization is another way of thinking about it, which is, maybe doing it every day or every week or on some kind of basis. And then the next part of the book looks at it from a team perspective. And then the next part of the book says, okay, if you're a team of teams, right, how should you think about prioritization? So from team of one to teams of many, here's how you want to think about prioritization. Here are the steps to go through. Here are some examples. Here are some methods for doing that.
We are interrupting today's episode to talk to you about Safe Co-Fund, the future of Agile financing. By now, we have all experienced the power of planning and executing with Safe, but for many of us, the friction of funding still exists. We've all been there. You have the conversations with the executives, you have all of the things in place, but the financing still gets in the way. Participatory budgeting aimed to address some of that, but pretend money didn't exactly sit well with the executive audience. Well, Safe Co-Fund is changing all of that. Co-Fund aims to facilitate your budgetary conversations in a way that promotes trust, transparency, and alignment. You may have heard of those things somewhere before. Check out the Safe core values. Anyway, but we aim to promote those things with leadership and our fiduciaries, and people who use it tell us it's fun. Safe Co-Fund. Get it? Co-Fund. Anyway, dive into Safe Co-Fund and more easily determine value stream funding collaboratively. Safe Co-Fund is participatory budgeting simplified. Explore Safe Co-Fund now in Safe Studio at safe.scaledagile.com. Now back to the show.
In your experience, having the framework it's helpful. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the most challenging thing or things when it comes to anyone making decisions about prioritization? Why is it hard?
Yeah, it's an interesting, part of it is that we're naturally very, very good at prioritizing simple things. And the world is much more complicated than that. And our lives are much more complicated than that. And working with other people makes it more complicated. And the situations we're in are complicated. So the problem is really about adjudicating or making trade-offs among things that are typically just below the top priority and just above the thing that's least, has the least priority. And there's a lot of them across lots of categories, because it's not just the projects you have, it's the projects you have, it's the people you need to see, it's the activities you need to engage in, it's the risks you're dealing with, the investments you need to make. There are lots of different categories of potential priorities, which I call items. And so you've got lots of categories, you've got lots of people, you've got lots of contexts or situations or circumstances you're in. You've got the pressure of time, the false sense of urgency that I think we have in the culture, and a finite set of resources for dealing with these things.
I think there's also a healthy dose of fear. I mean, if you look at a lot of the systems that people work in, right, it's a fear-based system. It's, byproducts of the Jack Welch era, where the further you get up in the pyramid, the higher you get, the more competitive it is, and the greater the consequences are if you fall off that pyramid. So I think when it comes to making prioritization decisions, when we want to have a systemic approach, right, where we want to think about what's the best thing for our customers, at some level, you get caught into, well, this thing is important to me and my business unit, and though I might recognize that that other thing is more important to the customers, I need to beat the VP or the SVP of that other business unit, because if I don't beat that person, they're going to get promoted. And we know that in our culture, it's an up or out perspective. So if that person wins, even though it's the best thing for the customer, what if I lose my job? Then I have to uproot my kids and I have to take them to a new school and I have to move across the country because jobs at that level don't fall from trees. And I think that's an underrated aspect of any decision-making process in our current incentive structure, right? There's just so much fear the higher up you get in that ecosystem, and people are just focused on surviving, and it's unfortunate.
I think, I mean, I'm a little over caffeinated, so excuse the interruptions, but I think
I am too. Harry, hold on. I've had like 300 milligrams in the last 45 minutes. I feel you.
I think you're right. And it's part of why I wrote the book, right? And chapter 13 talks about this. And it doesn't deal with fear directly because I try to stay, I mean, the book would have been 1,000 pages if I tried to tackle all of this. But what the book does is it says, look, if you're looking for better outcomes and you recognize that and accept the fact that your priorities are your inputs to those decisions, then perhaps you ought to consider that a methodology like AHP, the analytical hierarchical process, is possibly the only sensible methodology that you can use, because it's the one that counteracts exactly what you're talking about in a complex environment where there's a lot at stake.
I think we need to figure that out. And I don't think we're going to do it in the next 20 minutes, but you look at the last 4 years, and my word, can you believe it's been 4 years since COVID? It's insane. So I think that was an accelerator. I think before that, we talked about the speed of business changing. I think COVID pushed us over the edge. And then I think things like Gen AI were fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And with so many people trying to move so fast to stay relevant, to keep their businesses on the cutting edge, I think where we had all hoped that these new ways of working and thinking would lead us to success, I think what we're seeing instead is that in fear, people revert to survival mode, right? And they go back to these old ways of thinking and working and trying to survive. And it's going to be a problem that we have to solve, because if in these environments we push each other out of the way to try and get to the front, by the time we get there, we're going to look around, there's going to be nobody left, right? Yeah. We just would have got rid of all of our whole team essentially. So I think models like this, they help us start framing decision-making from a place other than fear. And I think that's helpful. I think recognizing the challenges, and I think one of the things we need to do in a leadership space is begin discussing why we behave the way that we do. Because I think as a consultant, right, we can all see it. And maybe even as an executive sitting in those seats, you know it. But there's not yet been a safe conversation about what do we do with it. Yeah. So I think that's going to be an important thing in the future. And I think that also is going to have an impact on productivity, right? So I think you mentioned in your book, the prioritization has an impact on productivity. But what do you think about the way that we prioritize influencing productivity?
Well, just coming back to something you said a minute ago, I mean, I'll answer your question in a second, but coming back to something you said a minute ago, one of the themes throughout the book, from the beginning of the book, and I've woven it all throughout the book, is that people will generally go along with a decision if they feel like they've been part of the process. And I mean, I don't just mean somebody who's been along in the passenger seat for the process, but I mean somebody who's really been heard and somebody whose ideas have been considered. And if the outcomes don't turn out the way that they hope, then at least they're not going to rebel in the end. And if they feel like they're a part of it, they're not necessarily going to sabotage things in between. And I think this notion of being able to work together is really, really important. And back to the notion of productivity, to your question a moment ago, one of the key ideas in the book is, I don't know if you've had a chance to read Oliver Burkeman's book, 4,000 Weeks, but
No.
it's
You're giving me so many good things, Harry. I love it. We're going to link all the books in the show notes because you've given me, this is the third. What was the last one again?
Oliver Burkeman's book, 4,000 Weeks, is an unbelievable treatise on the misguided notion we have about productivity and how to think about it. And philosophically speaking, I feel very much aligned with the work that he has, even though I'm looking at it from a very different point of view, because I'm coming at it through the lens of what's most important and how do you evaluate what you mean by the word important, right? And so from a productivity point of view, let's just start with the lens of individuals, right? From an individual point of view, I think if you want to connect prioritization to productivity, you have to look at what is it that you're avoiding that's bollocksing up all of your energy. And how do you prioritize that and act on it? And what do you do with the impending deluge of things that are, pushing on you and pressing on you because they're time sensitive, where they have a high cost of delay, right? And you want to prioritize against cost of delay because, if you wait too long, the tickets are going to get too expensive and eventually you're going to lose the seat and you can't go on the vacation, right? So if you can pinpoint the things that you're avoiding and then attack those and then identify the things that have a high cost of delay, not just the things that you think are urgent, but the things that are going to cost you, right? And then pinpoint those and nail the one that has the highest cost of delay and then work down the list there. And then finally, for the things that have, strategic importance, but aren't necessarily going to get your attention, how do you break those down and make them consumable enough that you can continue chipping away at them? Because, we as human beings, and I'm not making this up, this is sort of axiomatic at this point. We radically overestimate what we can accomplish in a short period of time and underestimate what we can do in a long period of time. And frankly, my writing this book is a perfect example of that, right? I thought I could do it in a year. Then I realized I couldn't do it in 2. Almost 8 years later, here it is.
We're eternally optimistic, Harry.
Exactly. And then from a team perspective, in terms of productivity, I mean, one of the places I focus on the book is, using something as simple as Luke Holman's kind of speedboat framework to pinpoint what's slowing your team down. What is preventing it from moving at the rate that it would need to move at? And maybe that's your lack of prioritization. I don't know. But if you can prioritize the things that are keeping you back, holding you back or impeding you, or you're, fearful of moving forward because you're afraid you're going to crash on the rocks in front of you per that particular framework, then by all means, figure those things out, start being honest with yourself about what the implications are. And then at an organizational level, it gets right back to what you said a minute ago. It's about having complete competing agendas, and those agendas are often based on, fear of losing something. And if you can agree on a model or agree on a process for working through that, you're in a much better place because, as I said a minute ago, if you can agree on that process, you're much less likely to sabotage the process as it's being executed, or disavow yourself of the results if they don't turn out the way that you otherwise would have hoped.
What do you think needs to change in an organization to create the safety to have those conversations?
That is a very good question. And the cheap and easy answer out of my book would be that I think we need to prioritize prioritization, right? I don't think we need to prioritize decision making, and I don't think we need to prioritize planning. I think we need to prioritize prioritization. We need to make it a first-class citizen, because if we can all agree that we need to be intentional about going about figuring out what matters most and what matters least. And we can agree on processes for making trade-offs in between all of that, whether you're at a team, you're a team of one, or you're on a, you're in or leading a team of many. I think you're in a much, much better place. So to me, this is where it starts.
Certainly. And I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that sometimes there's just toxic jerks in the system. And it's the reality, right? You talk about the impediment to prioritization. I mean, we can do all of the introspection that we like, and we can, do our best to build consensus and alignment among our peer group. But boy, sometimes there's toxic jerks in the system.
There's no doubt about that. And, this week I'm traveling to San Diego to attend Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, their extreme ownership muster. Are you familiar with that book?
Explicitly.
Yeah.
I'm a military guy. I drink a lot of Jocko Fuel in the day.
Okay.
For some of our more advanced programs, one of the recommended readings that I added was Extreme Ownership, because one of the things that, being a military guy myself, the words that just, to quote Peter Griffin, grind my gears the most are, "It's not my fault." I hate it. So when someone comes to me and says, "Well, I couldn't do X because of Y." Nope. No. Step one, you got to own it. Like if you're delivering a class, for example, I don't care that the tech didn't work. It was your responsibility to make sure that the tech did work. And if it didn't, it was your responsibility to have contingencies in place, because your ultimate responsibility is learner experience, right? So no matter what, as a leader, you're ultimately at fault. And if you come to me wanting a leadership position and you lead with excuses in your application, we're done. I'm going to probably give you a book to read and tell you to come back in 6 months.
Yeah.
So yes, I am familiar with Jocko.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. And, I know there are people who will challenge, folks like me and you about whether or not, people in the military should be writing books on leadership. But I think they're really onto something. So much so that I'm taking, the idea behind John Boyd's OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, and extending that for extreme ownership, anticipate, observe, orient, decide, act, monitor.
Are you familiar with the concept of a PACE plan?
I'm not.
So that's a framework we use to make plans in the military, right? So for every plan that you have your primary plan, which is the P. Mm-hmm. You have your alternate plan. So if the primary doesn't work out, what are you going to do instead? Mm-hmm. You're going to have your contingency that says, well, if those things don't work out, what am I going to do then? And then your emergency plan. If everything goes awry, how do I get out? Right. And so that's how we plan everything in my family. Right. So like we talk about, if there's a fire in the house, what do you do? Right. So maybe everybody musters and we go to the primary exit of the house as plan one. If there's a fire there, we go to the back door. The contingency is maybe we meet in the master bedroom and go down over the roof of the back porch, and it's maybe a 6 or 8 foot drop and you jump. The emergency is there's fire everywhere. You jump out of your windows. You're going to break some bones, but we're not going to die. And that's the concept that we follow, right? We always want to plan for best case scenario and worst case scenario with some different blocks in between. And I think that's the next step, right? When you talk about owning ultimate accountability for decisions, we also have to own how we plan and plan effectively. It's kind of that 360 considering all possible scenarios approach. So you always have a path forward no matter what happens.
I love that. I'm now wishing I wish I'd known about that. I wish I'd written about that in my book, but I learned something new today. Thank you.
There's always your next one, Harry.
Yeah.
Or you can do like I did. I don't have a copy of it sitting here. I've rewrote the same book 3 times over the last 7 years. Mm-hmm. So I wrote the original book in 2017, and then I updated it in 2020 after the pandemic. And then I updated it this year again with all I learned from Gen AI. So you've got a lot of opportunities to try and add and evolve or do another one.
Well, it's funny you mention this because I wrote the acknowledgments for my book using, was it the CEE method, right? Mm-hmm. Critical, I always forget the middle E, I got this from one of the Navy SEALs that's written extensively. Critical, something, and enhancing. Right? Critical is you can't complete the mission without it. The middle E, the name of which I'm forgetting, is it's going to be a lot harder if you don't have it, and enhancing is the one that's going to make it a lot nicer if you got it. Right? So
critical, essential, enhanced.
Essential. There you go. Thank you.
Let me ask you, Harry, have you read your book?
I have hundreds of times.
Have you? I can't do it. I don't read anything that I write. So I get it done good enough and I give it to somebody else, because if I ever take a second look at it, it will never see the light of day.
You're a better writer than I am is the problem.
It's not that I'm a better writer. It's just that I know my weaknesses and I have really good copy editors.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
I get really self-conscious about it. And I just dump all my ideas. I mean, I'll start with a story arc. I'll create an outline, I'll add context to the outline. And then my next pass is all the words on paper. And then I give it to somebody else. And then they'll come back and they'll have suggestions, and maybe the flow's wrong, or maybe I forget something and I'll add it. But I will not go back and read it, because if I do, I will destroy it.
Well,
as in I will shred it, delete it, reformat my hard drive. It'll never live.
It explains why it took me almost 8 years to write this book, because I kept rereading.
Oh, goodness. Well, Harry, it's been a great convo. Is there anything that you would like to leave folks with before we push them to go read your book?
I would pick up a copy of Oliver Burkeman's book, 4,000 Weeks, and read through that and really kind of meditate on it, because I think there's some deep philosophy there that it's going to help people improve their lives and take some of the pressure off them for, not producing as much, not being as fast, not working as hard, not getting as much done. And I think it's a good place to start.
Would it offend you if I added a yes and to that?
No, not at all.
I think after that, a good book to maybe check out is called Deep Work by Cal Newport.
Oh, great book.
Which talks about the need for us to be able to focus on doing deep work.
Yeah.
So if you've got good prioritization and good alignment, you can then figure out where you spend your most focused time. And I think the faster the world moves, that really is the skill of the future. How quick can you learn, and how deeply can you focus to execute that learning?
Yeah, Cal Newport's got some really nice strategies in that book for really pushing things away and focusing on what matters most.
Certainly, starting with turning off your phone.
Exactly.
Harry, thank you so much. Let's make sure we check out Harry's book, Managing Priorities, How to Create Better Plans and Make Smarter Decisions. And where can they find that, Harry? Where can they find you?
Well, the easiest place to find me right now is on LinkedIn. The book will be out, if everything goes well, the end of this quarter. So it's not out yet. But if you go to rosenfeldmedia.com, you can sign up to get notified when it's out. And I look forward to hearing from anybody that's got questions, thoughts, concerns. But LinkedIn, I'm Harry Max everywhere.
And you know what? This is slated to drop on March 27th, so that should be pretty darn close to the day your book's available.
Good timing.
I love it. Harry, thanks so much for making the time. We'll see you out there.
All right. Thank you much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. The entire team at Scaled Agile is focused on helping you and your enterprise work differently and build the future. If you find this content valuable, please tell your colleagues and friends and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. To share your suggestions for the show, just drop us a line at podcast@scaledagile.com. I'm Adam Mattis. See you next time.